We're continuing on with what we're dealing with last week, which is the actual clash between Arminianism and Calvinism in the late century, in the 1590s, running on to 1600. And actually, Arminius was Jacobus Arminius. He was born actually in 1560, so he was only 4 years of age when Calvin died in 64. So these two men, they never really knew each other. They were both lived in the Netherlands for most of their lives, but actually they never really knew each other, of course, because he was only an infant when actually Calvin died. But he was also a great theologian in the same league as Calvin himself. And he thought seriously about actually the whole doctrine of predestination that Calvin had left behind in his writings, and was very much almost unquestioned at the time that Arminius done his early studies as a teenager in theology, and then he went on and done a degree, and then of course he went on and done a doctorate and was a professor in the university. So he was a very influential theologian in the Netherlands, so therefore his ideas were listened to very much. But as he got older, went into his 30s and especially in his 40s, Arminius began to question the whole idea of predestination, that some people are born part of the elect and some people are outside the elect, and that actually that all this idea of predestination, he was unhappy with that actually, basically, because a lot of there is certain verses in the Bible that support that Calvinist predestination idea if you look at them in a certain out of context, but the overall message of the Bible is that actually that God desires everyone to be saved, and that the actual death of Christ is available for everyone, and it depends largely on whether or not people respond in a positive or a negative manner to actually God's grace. So actually, as Arminius began to read the Bible in its overall context, he began to become more and more uneasy with the whole concept of predestination. And he came up with this idea of conditional election. And what he meant by that was that you're part of the elect if you actually respond in a positive manner. And he basically observed people throughout their lives. Some people were supposed to be part of the elect, then they have done some serious crime or some murder somebody or whatever, and Calvinist doctrine would solve that problem by saying they were never part of the elect, which is a little bit silly really, but because everyone believed they were part of the elect at an earlier stage in their life. So Arminius actually recognizes that it depends really on people's response to that actually God's grace is essential for salvation. This is what he's saying, absolutely essential. That was part of the Lutheran and Calvinist idea as well, that God's grace is essential, absolutely central to salvation. But Arminius is saying actually that human response is also important. There's also a disagreement in relation to, of course, similar idea. It's the idea of limited atonement, which is part of the Calvinist doctrine. Arminius would say that that's not really true, that atonement is universal. It's available to everybody. The thief on the cross is an example of that. That anybody can change at any stage in their life and actually accept and decide to actually change their ways and actually become good Christians at any time in their life, even right up to the last minute. So there's also the talk about the ability of the human being. This goes back, of course, to Augustine, who actually talked about human ability being wounded by the fall. And Luther exaggerated that to a certain extent. He might have sort of only have access to some of Augustine's writings, especially in regard to Augustine's argument with the Pelagians. And Luther tended to either exaggerate or to some extent misunderstand what actually Augustine was actually talking about there. He wasn't talking about actually human nature being absolutely destroyed, which would mean that everything depends on God's grace and human input has no effect whatsoever. That's what Luther claimed in his doctrine, or in his book, The Bondage of the Will, in 1525. And to a certain extent, this is what actually caused Calvin to follow through on this logic, that human beings have nothing to do with their own salvation. This is the bondage of the will theory. Calvin actually followed this through further to say that, therefore, God does everything, human beings do nothing. And then Arminius comes along and he recognizes that there is actually some truth in the idea of human nature being wounded but not destroyed. That's what Luther is claiming, that human nature is destroyed in terms of salvation. Therefore, human free will has nothing to do with salvation. Calvin is promoting that idea as well, and he develops into a tunnel vision of predestination. And here we have Arminius looking at the overall Bible and looking at the overall theology of the Catholic Church and of the actual Luther's ideas and Calvin ideas, and beginning to revert back to the Catholic idea that actually human nature has some input into their own salvation. So that's what this entire argument is about. Arminius died he only lived to be 49 years of age. He died in 1609. And in the aftermath of his death, some of the great theologians in the Netherlands, the ministers, decided to actually formalize his ideas, bring them together. They didn't want to see them lost. They wanted to see, he would probably have intended writing a great book with all his theology, but he was taken suddenly at a relatively young age before he got time to combine all his ideas. And these theologians, in the aftermath of his death in 1610, the following year, decided to put together all his ideas into a document known as the Remonstrance. And that actually there were basically 5 principles. And the 5 principles were actually the reverse of what Calvinism came to be, which is a rejection of Arminianism, which is, best remember it as by the word TULIP, and that is actually, the TULIP, the word actually is spells out 5 basic principles of Calvinism, which is that the T stands for total depravity, which means that human nature is completely destroyed at the time of the fall. Augustine and other theologians said, no, human nature is wounded and there is place for human free will. Calvinism says, no, human nature is destroyed. That's the whole concept of total depravity. It's not actually really, it's not something that Jesus Christ ever talked about. He never talked about total depravity. This is something that theologians came up with. It's a phrase about human nature being totally destroyed. It largely contradicts the whole idea of moral theology, where you're consistently told, keep the commandments in various different ways. There'd be no point in that if people were totally depraved or your human nature was destroyed. The second idea is unconditional election. That's another concept of Calvinism, which means that it doesn't matter what sort of a person you are, God decides whether or not you're going to be saved. He decided it millions of years before you were born. That sort of theology is to do with kind of fatalistic determinism. Arminian came on, he looked at that and he actually said, that's probably not true. That actually that the human response to God actually has probably some input into whether or not they're saved. So this is another clash between Arminianism and Calvinism. And of course then the third letter in TULIP is L. It stands for limited atonement. This is part of Calvinism as well, that only the elect themselves, obviously themselves, is what they think they're talking about. But every sort of minority group, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, every little small cult is within both the Christian religion and every other religion. They all believe that about themselves. And Calvin was no different to anybody else, in the sense that he promoted a doctrine that we're going to be saved and everybody else that doesn't belong to this group is not going to be saved. It's part of the cult nature of a lot of religious groups to actually promote that idea, but it's actually not in line with the actual Christian message, which is that salvation is available to everybody, and actually it's up to people to respond in a negative manner or a positive manner to that. So that's why the actual the Catholic theology as well. Of course, Arminius is very influenced by Catholic theology, and although he stays within the Reformed theology and the Reformed Church, he's born into it and that, all his friends are in it and all that. But his actual theology is very much Catholic in regard to this idea of, he rejects this whole idea of limited atonement. And there's another idea then, which is the I part of the TULIP word, which is irresistible grace. Irresistible grace means that once God decides you're going to be saved whether you want to be saved or not. It's a bit daft, but that's actually part of the doctrine. Irresistible grace means that you're going to be saved whether you want to be saved or not. It's almost like you're going to heaven whether you want to go or not. It's another sort of form of daftness, really. It doesn't really line up with the overall Christian theology. The whole idea of irresistible grace is another contradiction of the whole human free will. And of course, they carry through then as well, Calvinism does, with the perseverance of the saints, which means that once you're saved, you're always saved. Once you're part of the elect, you're always part of it. If a person that was supposed to be part of the elect for 20 years, lived a great life, then falls out with somebody, murders somebody or whatever, Calvinism solves that problem. Well, they actually don't solve it, but they actually explain that problem by saying that this person was never part of the elect in the first place. You can believe that if you want to, but actually it's a necessary doctrine once you get rid of the idea of confession. And Luther was never sure about whether he should get rid of confession or not. That was something that Calvin was very strong on. But Luther knew that this could be a difficult scenario, that once you actually are saved or supposed to be saved, you're part of this group that's supposed to be saved, and then you do some serious crime. How do you solve that problem? Well, Calvinism in their own way solved it by saying, that person was never part of the elect. But here Arminius is actually saying something different. He's saying there has to be a way back for people, because virtually everybody is imperfect at some stage in their life. There has to be some way of coming back into the salvation of the church. This is very much a doctrine of the Catholic Church as well, of course. And Arminius, in terms of the salvation theology that he produced, the 5 points of Arminianism, is very Catholic, and that's actually why there was such a clash with Calvinism. That's why there was a council then, a church council, a Reformed church council in Dort in 1618, 1619. And this was, of course, 60 years after Calvin actually had died. And they decided, the Calvinists in the Netherlands decided to actually outline their particular belief. They rejected all of Arminianisms, all of Arminian's theology. So from that point forward, from the Synod of Dort onwards, Calvinism became known as by the idea of TULIP, which is total depravity. T is total depravity, U is unconditional election, L is limited atonement, only for the select few. Atonement and salvation is only for the select few, namely Calvinists themselves, those that are the people that are inside the camp. That's part of the attraction of Calvinism, that it actually gives great assurance to people that actually accept that theology, and it actually pretends to know that other people are not saved, which is a bit of it's a bit arrogant, to put it mildly. And then, of course, the irresistible grace is another part of their doctrine, that once you're decided that God is going to save you, you're going to be saved whether you want to be saved or not. That's actually the doctrine. That's the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism. Calvinism can best be described as the TULIP idea, which is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement just for themselves, irresistible grace, you're going to be saved whether you want to be saved or not, and perseverance of the saints. Once you're saved, you're always going to be saved. Doesn't matter what you do, you're saved anyway. That's part of the elect, part of the elite. All that sort of stuff is Calvinism. Arminianism is very much a Catholic idea. It's in the sense of this particular idea of salvation and all that. Arminius actually questions the whole idea of Calvinism. He recognizes really that Calvin has gone to such an extreme that he's basically wrong. That Calvin is only a teenager at the time that Luther was writing his book, The Bondage of the Will. He's very impressed by Luther. He thinks that Luther is almost like Jesus Christ himself, that he can't make a mistake. And he reads this book, The Bondage of the Will, all this thing about human nature being totally destroyed. He goes along with all that. But as he thinks through the logic of that, he finds himself, as he goes through life and gets into various different debates, he actually finds himself going for this double predestination. Some people are damned, some people are saved. It doesn't matter what sort of lives they live. Human nature has no input. This is all Calvinism. Arminius comes along and he recognizes that there's a lot of truth in what the Catholic Church is actually saying, that human nature is not destroyed, that human nature is damaged by the actual fall, but it's not destroyed, and therefore human will has an input into salvation, and actually the way people live, the choices they make, all this is part of salvation. And therefore Arminius is actually basically rejecting Calvinism, and he actually the actual Arminian ministers in the aftermath of the Synod of Dort in 1618, 1619, they find themselves sidetracked from the church actually, and about 200 ministers lose their jobs, they lose their part in the church. But because it's such a strong doctrine, a Catholic doctrine actually, it re-emerges, of course, decades later in the Netherlands, and of course it finds its full strength in America, where you don't have the state imposing a religion as you did in the Netherlands and various places like Scotland and that, imposing Calvinism. The power of the state was behind Calvinism in a lot of these places, and a lot of wars and everything else, whereby Arminianism, especially in the United States, where people are free to make up their mind what religion they want to actually follow, you find that it becomes a more dominant theology in the later centuries. That's because it's actually basically to do with common sense, that human beings and their decisions has some input into salvation. That's what Arminianism is saying. So that's my attempt to explain the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism, which is basically a form of Catholic Church theology. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see other videos like this. Goodbye for now.